The autumn wind carried the scent of burning hay across the Nebraska plains, thick smoke rising against the violet dusk sky. Mary Cooper stood at the edge of her property, watching flames devour the barn that had stood for 3 generations. Her grandfather's old Sharps rifle felt heavy in her hands as she watched 20 years of work turn to ash. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, Mary had already weathered more storms than most. First losing her husband Thomas to the war, and now this. But what the men who'd set the fire didn't know, what no one in Clearwater Valley knew, was that Mary Cooper had been born Mary Hawthorne, daughter of the infamous Ghost of the Plains. The flames cast dancing shadows across the scorched earth, illuminating the cruel message the thugs had left carved into her fence post: sell or burn. The Blackwood Rail Company wasn't known for subtlety. They'd been buying up farms all along the planned railway route, their tactics growing more aggressive with each passing month. First came the offers, then the threats, and finally the accidents that seemed to plague any farmer who refused to sell. Mary's farm sat at a crucial junction where the hills opened into a natural pass, the only feasible route for the railway through these parts. She'd transformed her late husband's struggling homestead into the most prosperous farm in the valley. But it wasn't just her agricultural skill that had made this land valuable. The strategic position of her property made it the key to controlling the entire railway expansion. Silas Montgomery, her closest neighbor, came riding hard down the dirt road, his face grave in the fading light. "Mary, I saw the smoke from my place. The marshal's away in Lincoln, won't be back for days." He paused, taking in the destruction. Maybe it's time to consider their offer. No shame in selling when they're playing dirty." Mary's fingers tightened on the rifle's stock, muscle memory from a lifetime ago responding to its familiar weight. She'd spent 20 years building a new life, trying to escape her father's legacy. Howard Ghost Hawthorne hadn't just been the most feared marksman in the territories. He'd been a master of defensive warfare, using his extraordinary shooting skills not just for combat, but to control key positions and protect vital resources. Barn's timber cracked and groaned as another section collapsed. Mary watched the flames with an unsettling clarity of mind, her father's teachings surfacing from the depths of memory. The Blackwood Rail Company thought they were dealing with a simple widow, someone they could intimidate or buy out. They had no idea they were facing someone who'd learned strategy from the man who'd once outshot Wild Bill Hickok himself. "Miss Cooper!" Young Jacob, her teenage farmhand, came running from the direction of the house. "Riders coming. Looks like Mr. Harrison from the rail company, with some rough types." Mary felt old instincts awakening, her mind automatically assessing distances and angles just as she'd been taught. She noted how the approaching men spread out, trying to look casual while establishing clear fields of fire. William Harrison emerged from the growing darkness, his expensive suit out of place in the rugged valley. 4 hard-looking men flanked him, their gun belts riding low in the style of professional killers. Mary recognized their type immediately, though she pretended not to notice how they positioned themselves around her. "Mrs. Cooper," Harrison called out, his tone carefully measured despite the threat implicit in his men's positioning. "Unfortunate business with your barn. These are dangerous times. Accidents happen when people don't see reason." "Mr. Harrison." Mary kept her voice steady, though her fingers remembered the precise pressure needed on a hair trigger. "I wasn't expecting another visit so soon. My answer hasn't changed since last week." Harrison's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "The situation has changed, madam. We've discovered some irregularities in the original land grants. It seems your property rights might not be as secure as you thought." Mary felt a familiar coldness settle over her, a clarity of thought she hadn't experienced since she'd left. Her father's house. Harrison was lying. She knew every detail of her land rights because she understood something he didn't. This farm's value went beyond its strategic location. Her father had taught her to choose property not just for its visible advantages, but for its defensive potential. The rail company's surveyors had mapped the obvious routes through the hills, but they didn't understand the hidden strengths of this land. Every ridge, every fold in the terrain had been carefully evaluated before she'd chosen this spot. Her father's teachings about fields of fire, overlapping cover, and defensive positions had guided her choice as much as the soil's fertility. "My rights are perfectly secure, Mr. Harrison," Mary replied calmly, "though I'm sure the Territorial Office would be interested in examining your company's recent activities just as carefully." One of Harrison's men, a weather-beaten killer with dead eyes, shifted his hand closer to his gun. Mary noticed the movement without seeming to, her mind automatically calculating angles and distances. These men were used to intimidating ordinary farmers. They had no idea they were threatening someone who'd spent her childhood learning the art of tactical shooting from the greatest marksman the territories had ever known. "That's the problem with women trying to run businesses," Harrison sighed, dropping all pretense of courtesy. "They don't understand how things really work. We're taking control of this valley, one way or another. The smart folks have already sold. The stubborn ones—" He gestured at his armed companions. "Well, accidents happen. You have until sundown tomorrow to reconsider our offer," Harrison announced, already turning his horse. "After that, we can't be responsible for any unfortunate events that might occur." As they rode away, Mary remained outwardly calm, while her mind raced with plans. She'd spent 20 years building a new life, trying to escape her father's violent legacy. But as she watched the last flames consume her barn, she knew the time for hiding was over. "Jacob," she called to the young farmhand who'd reappeared at her side, "ride into town. Send a telegram to H. Hawthorne in Deadwood. Just 3 words. Mary needs you." The boy rushed to comply, not understanding the significance of the message. He carried. Mary watched him go, feeling the weight of her father's teachings settling back onto her shoulders. She'd chosen peace for 20 years, but she was still her father's daughter. Harrison and his men had no idea they weren't just threatening a widow's farm. They were awakening something that had been sleeping in the Nebraska plains for 2 decades. Behind her scorched barn, hidden beneath innocent-looking hay bales, lay her father's old gun chest. Inside rested not just weapons, but detailed maps showing every ridge, hollow, and vantage point in 3 counties. The ghost of the plains hadn't maintained his fearsome reputation through marksmanship alone. He'd controlled territory through superior positioning and an unmatched understanding of tactical advantage. Mary Cooper stood watching the smoky rise against the darkening sky, knowing that by this time tomorrow everything would change. The quiet farmer's widow was about to remind the territory why the name Hawthorne had once made even the most hardened gunman think twice about causing trouble in the plains. Sarah Chen, her housekeeper of 8 years, emerged from the house with a rifle of her own. Unlike most of the valley's residents, Sarah knew fragments of Mary's true history. She'd seen the way Mary could shoot the head off a snake at 50 paces without seeming to aim, the way she instinctively noted distances and angles, even while doing mundane farm work. "They'll come back before dawn," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd survived her own share of violence. "Harrison's type always do. They like to catch people sleeping." Mary nodded, already formulating plans. "Get word to Miguel at the south pasture. Tell him to move the cattle to the hidden valley behind the ridge, then help Jacob secure the root cellar." The farmhouse held secrets that even Sarah didn't know about. Behind the root cellar's false wall lay a hidden room housing more than just her father's weapons. There were maps, tactical documents, and journals filled with the accumulated knowledge of the plains' greatest marksman. Through the kitchen window, she could see old Thomas Weber at his carpentry bench, pretending to work while stealing worried glances at the yard. The German immigrant had been her tenant for 5 years, living in the small cottage by the creek. He was more than just a skilled woodworker. He'd fought in the European wars, and Mary had recognized in him the same tactical mindset her father had drilled into her. "Mrs. Cooper," Thomas approached, his accent thicker with concern. "Those men, they are not just common thugs. The one with the scar, I know his type from the old country. He is what we called a Kriegsminister, a master of war." Mary's tactical assessment had already identified the scarred man as the most dangerous of Harrison's killers. "Tell me what you saw, Thomas." "The way they spread out, how they watched the high ground. They are planning something big. And that Harrison fellow, he was too confident. Men like that, they don't show such confidence unless they have already arranged things in their favor." Mary's mind was already working through the implications. Harrison wouldn't have made such a bold move without ensuring local law enforcement would look the other way. The Blackwood Rail Company wouldn't have escalated to burning barns without first securing political protection. The warm autumn wind carried away the last embers of her burning barn, and with them the last traces of her peaceful life. But as Mary Cooper watched darkness settle over her threatened land, she felt something awakening, not just her father's combat teachings, but a deeper understanding of how power and violence really worked in the territories. Harrison and his men thought they were simply threatening a widow's farm. They had no idea they were about to face someone who understood not just marksmanship, but the intricate dance of position, timing, and psychological warfare that had made the Ghost of the Plains a legend. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across Clearwater Valley as Mary Cooper studied the aftermath of the morning's confrontation. Harrison's men had withdrawn to a safe distance, but she could see them establishing camps along the valley's edges. Through her father's telescope, she noted their improved positioning. They were learning, adapting to the unexpected challenge they'd encountered. "They're bringing in supplies," Sarah Chen reported, returning from her careful observation of the eastern approach. "Wagons coming in from the rail depot. But there's something else. Wooden crates, long ones, the kind that might hold specialist equipment." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mary's tactical assessment shifted. Harrison wasn't just laying siege, he was preparing for something more sophisticated. The rail company had resources beyond simply hired guns, and her demonstration of precision shooting had forced them to reconsider their approach. Thomas Weber studied the enemy positions with experienced eyes. "Look there, the way they're setting up barriers, establishing interlocking fields of fire. Someone's advising them who knows about counter-sniper operations." Through her network of allies, Mary learned that Harrison had telegraphed east for reinforcements. The rail company was calling in specialists, not just gunmen, but experts in long-range combat. They'd faced skilled shooters before and had developed strategies to counter them. "Mrs. Cooper," Jacob called softly from the barn's remains. "Riders, coming in from the north, but these are different." The boy's eyes had proven remarkably sharp, and Mary had come to trust his observations. 2 men moving carefully, one's carrying what looks like survey equipment. Mary studied the newcomers through the telescope. The first rider she didn't recognize, a lean, professional-looking man who carried himself like a military officer. But the second figure made her breath catch. Even at this distance, she recognized the distinctive way he sat his horse, the familiar rifle scabbard at his saddle. "The ghost rides again," Thomas murmured, noting Mary's reaction. "That's him, isn't it? Your father?" Howard Ghost Hawthorne hadn't changed as much as Mary had expected. His hair had gone fully grey, but he still moved with the fluid grace that had made him legendary. As he dismounted at the farm's border, Mary saw him immediately begin reading the land, his eyes measuring distances and angles just as he'd taught her. The reunion was brief, professional. 20 years of separation had left too much unsaid for easy conversation. But as Mary led her father and his companion, introduced only as Major Camden, to the hidden room behind the root cellar, she saw approval in the ghost's eyes as he studied her preparations. "You remembered," he said simply, examining the mapped firing positions and range calculations, not just the shooting, but the thinking behind it. Major Camden was examining Mary's tactical diagrams with growing respect. "This is brilliant work. You've turned the entire valley into a geometric problem. Every approach has been measured, every position accounted for." But Howard Hawthorne was already seeing beyond the immediate defenses. "Harrison won't just be bringing in shooters," he warned. "The rail companies have learned from past confrontations. They'll have new technology, modern equipment we haven't seen before." As if confirming his words, more wagons were arriving at Harrison's camp. Mary's telescope revealed strange equipment being unloaded, brass instruments that caught the sun, tripods and lenses that suggested something more complex than simple firearms. "Range-finding equipment," Major Camden explained, his military experience showing. "New designs from Europe. They're bringing in a scientific approach to counter your precision shooting." Mary's mind was already adapting to this new threat. "They think technology will overcome skill and preparation," she noted, moving to her father's old workbench. From a hidden compartment came more of the ghost's innovations, custom-made tools and instruments he'd developed during his years controlling territory through long-range shooting. "Show me what you've maintained," Howard instructed, and Mary led them to the hunting blinds that had proven so effective in the morning's confrontation. But these weren't simple hide positions. Each had been carefully prepared with advanced features, wind indicators, elevation markers, and precise range calculations to multiple target points. Major Camden studied the preparations with professional appreciation. "You've created a complete system of interlocking positions. Each blind supports the others, covering potential counter-sniper positions. But there's something more." His voice trailed off as he noticed subtle details in Mary's defensive design. "Howard," Hawthorne smiled slightly. "You see it, don't you? She hasn't just prepared firing positions. She's created a complete approach to territorial control. Every ridgeline, every fold in the ground serves multiple purposes." The afternoon brought new developments. Harrison's specialists had begun setting up their equipment. Theodolites for measuring angles, barometers for atmospheric calculations, and other instruments Mary didn't recognize. But she understood their purpose. The rail company was bringing modern military science to bear against what they saw as outdated marksmanship skills. "They'll try to turn this into a methodical operation," Major Camden explained, watching the enemy preparations. "Mathematical calculations, precise measurements. They think they can reduce long-range shooting to pure science." But Howard Hawthorne saw something his daughter had already understood. They're still thinking like soldiers, looking for military solutions. They haven't realized this is about more than just shooting. Through her careful observation network, Mary learned more about Harrison's preparations. The rail company wasn't just bringing in shooting experts. They were establishing a complete tactical operations center. Maps were being prepared, calculations made, and a systematic approach to countering her defensive positions was being developed. "Look at their survey teams," Thomas observed as evening approached. "They're mapping everything, trying to create a complete mathematical model of the battlefield." Sarah Chen, returning from another scouting trip, brought more significant news. "They've got telegrams coming in from Army contacts. Military experts are being consulted about siege operations and counter-sniper tactics." But Mary had anticipated even this level of escalation. While Harrison's men focused on mathematical solutions and modern technology, she was implementing strategies that went beyond simple ballistics. Her father's teachings hadn't just been about shooting. They'd been about understanding how to control territory through a combination of skill, psychology, and careful preparation. "Show me the night positions," Howard instructed as darkness fell. Mary revealed another layer of her defensive preparation. Special firing points had been established for low-light conditions, with precisely calculated ranges and carefully prepared approaches that took advantage of the land's natural features. Major Camden examined these preparations with growing respect. "This isn't just about defending a farm anymore. You've created a complete system for controlling this entire valley." Howard Hawthorne watched his daughter with quiet pride. She hadn't just maintained his teachings, she'd evolved them into something more sophisticated. While Harrison brought in modern technology and military expertise, Mary had developed an approach to territorial control that combined old skills with new innovation. "They think they're facing a skilled shooter," he observed as they studied the enemy preparations. "They don't understand they're encountering an entirely different approach to controlling land." Through the gathering darkness, Mary could see lights burning in Harrison's command tent. The rail company was mobilizing significant resources, bringing in experts and equipment to counter what they saw as a simple marksmanship challenge. But their very sophistication revealed their fundamental misunderstanding. "Let them bring their science," Mary said quietly, checking the custom sights on her father's old Sharps rifle. "They haven't learned what you taught me. That true mastery of territory comes from understanding more than just trajectory and wind speed." The night brought new activity from Harrison's camp. Survey teams were moving under cover of darkness, placing markers and taking measurements. They were preparing for what they thought would be a methodical dismantling of her defenses. But Mary Cooper, daughter of the Ghost of the Plains, was about to show them why some skills couldn't be countered by mere technology. Major Camden revealed the deeper purpose of his presence as they reviewed defensive positions. "The Army's been watching Harrison's operations," he explained, unrolling a map marked with railroad expansion routes. "The Blackwood Rail Company isn't just building track. They're establishing strategic control points across the territory. Every farm they've seized sits at a crucial junction." Howard Hawthorne studied the map with growing concern. "This goes beyond simple rail expansion. They're creating a network of controlled positions. Each property they've taken gives them command of key terrain." "Like chess pieces on a board," Mary observed, seeing the pattern emerge. "My farm isn't just valuable for the railway pass, it's part of a larger strategic plan." Sarah Chen appeared. At the hidden door, her expression urgent. "More equipment arriving at Harrison's camp. They're unloading some kind of armored shields, heavy steel plates on wheeled frames." Through her father's telescope, Mary studied the new defensive equipment. Harrison's men were preparing mobile cover that could be advanced under fire, a sophisticated response to precision shooting. But what caught her attention was the man supervising the operation, a tall figure in an army officer's coat. Colonel James Blackwood. Major Camden identified him grimly. Harrison's employer's brother, he commanded artillery units during the war, specializing in siege operations. "If he's here, they're planning something big." Howard Hawthorne's weathered face showed new concern. "James Blackwood. I crossed paths with him in '73. He's dangerous, not just because of his military expertise, but because he understands the psychological aspects of combat." Mary's tactical assessment shifted with this new information. The rail company wasn't just escalating with technology. They were bringing in someone who understood the deeper principles of territorial control. Colonel Blackwood had built his reputation on breaking defensive positions that others considered impregnable. "Show me your ammunition supplies," Howard instructed, and Mary revealed another aspect of her preparation: Beyond the hidden room lay a carefully organized reloading station. Custom tools, precision molds, and specialized powder measures lined the workbench. Major Camden examined the setup with growing appreciation. You're not just shooting standard ammunition, you're crafting custom loads for specific ranges and conditions. Another of Father's lessons, Mary confirmed, demonstrating the precise measuring techniques she'd maintained over the years. Every cartridge is tailored to its purpose, different powder charges for different distances, custom bullets for varying wind conditions. Through her observation network, Mary learned that Colonel Blackwood was implementing his own systematic approach. Survey teams were now operating in pairs, one group taking measurements while the other provided armed protection. They were establishing a comprehensive understanding of the battlefield while minimizing their vulnerability to long-range fire. "Notice how they're moving," Howard observed, studying their operations. "Short, coordinated actions, never staying in one place long enough to make a target. Blackwood's teaching them to operate under precision fire." But Mary had anticipated even this level of tactical sophistication. While Harrison's men focused on technological solutions and military doctrine, she was preparing to demonstrate a different kind of expertise, one that went beyond simple marksmanship or tactical theory. As night settled over Clearwater Valley, the opposing forces continued their preparations. In Harrison's camp, Colonel Blackwood gathered his specialists for detailed planning sessions. Modern military science was being brought to bear against what they saw as an outdated form of resistance. But in Mary's farmhouse, a different kind of preparation was underway. Howard Hawthorne shared advanced shooting techniques he'd developed since their separation, while Major Camden provided valuable intelligence about military counter-sniper operations. The quiet farmer's widow was about to show Harrison, Blackwood, and the entire rail company that true mastery of territory required more than just modern equipment or military expertise. It required something that couldn't be measured by their sophisticated instruments or countered by their tactical doctrine. The accumulated wisdom of those who understood that controlling land was an art as much as a science, passed down through generations of careful observation and hard-won experience. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows across Clearwater Valley as Colonel Blackwood initiated his first coordinated operation. Mary Cooper, observing through her father's telescope, watched a sophisticated military approach unfold. Survey teams moved under the protection of the new armored shields, while support groups established multiple bases of fire. They're implementing a technique developed during the war, Major Camden explained, studying the enemy movements, creating interlocking fields of fire to neutralize defensive positions one by one. Blackwood used this to break Confederate sharpshooter nests at Petersburg, but what caught Mary's attention wasn't the obvious military deployment. Her carefully positioned observers reported subtle movements in the surrounding hills, small teams carrying specialized equipment, moving into unexpected positions. "They're not just trying to suppress our firing points," Howard Hawthorne noted, his experienced eye catching details others might miss. "Look at those instrument teams. They're establishing a grid system, trying to map every possible shooting position." Sarah Chen, returning from a scouting mission, brought concerning news. "They've got some kind of new range-finding device, brass and glass, mounted on tripods. The technicians were talking about something called triangulation." Colonel Blackwood was implementing a scientific approach to counter-sniping. His teams were using advanced surveying techniques to create a mathematical model of the entire valley. Every ridge, every potential firing position was being mapped and measured with precision instruments. "He's trying to turn this into a problem of geometry and physics," Major Camden observed. "If they can calculate exact distances and elevations, they can use volley fire to suppress any position we might use." Thomas Weber, watching from a concealed observation post, spotted something significant. The survey teams, they're marking specific points with metal stakes, and look at those cables they're running between positions. Mary's tactical mind processed this new information. The rail company wasn't just mapping the terrain. They were establishing a sophisticated communication network. The cables would allow Blackwood's teams to coordinate their operations with unprecedented precision. "There's more," Sarah reported. "They've brought in former artillery officers. I saw them, setting up calculating tables in the command tent. They're treating this like an artillery problem, plotting firing solutions for multiple weapons. But what Blackwood and his specialists didn't realize was that Mary had anticipated even this level of technological sophistication. While they focused on creating a perfect mathematical model of the battlefield, she was preparing to demonstrate why some skills couldn't be reduced to simple calculations. "Show them what you learned about false positions," Howard instructed, and Mary implemented the next phase of her defense. Carefully prepared decoys began appearing at seemingly random points across the valley, indicators that would draw the attention of Blackwood's survey teams. "Look how they're responding," Major Camden noted with professional interest. "Their whole system depends on identifying and mapping our positions. Every decoy we reveal forces them to stop and conduct detailed measurements." Through her observation network, Mary learned that Blackwood's operation was already facing unexpected challenges. Their sophisticated instruments were detecting anomalies they couldn't easily explain, variations in elevation that didn't match. Their maps, wind patterns that seemed to defy normal conditions. "Your father taught you well," Thomas commented, watching the enemy's growing frustration. "They're trying to create a perfect mathematical model, but you've made the very land itself deceptive." Howard Hawthorne allowed himself a slight smile. The Ghost's first rule of territorial control: make the enemy fight the land itself before they ever face your rifle. As the morning progressed, Blackwood's systematic approach began to encounter more complications. His survey teams reported conflicting measurements. Positions that seemed perfect for counterfire proved to have hidden vulnerabilities. The very precision of their instruments was becoming a weakness, detecting complexities they couldn't easily resolve. "They're falling into the oldest trap in warfare," Major Camden observed, "believing that superior technology guarantees victory." But Colonel Blackwood wasn't easily deterred. Mary's telescope revealed new equipment being deployed: barometers for measuring atmospheric conditions, wind gauges at multiple elevations, and even more sophisticated range-finding devices. "He's trying to account for every variable," Howard noted, studying the enemy's preparations. "Air density, wind drift, even the Earth's rotation at these distances. He thinks he can turn long-range shooting into pure science." Sarah Chen, watching from another observation post, spotted a new development. They're setting up some kind of calculated firing positions, multiple rifles mounted on precision frames, all aimed at pre-measured coordinates. Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she understood Blackwood's strategy. He wasn't trying to outshoot her. He was establishing a system where multiple average shooters, firing according to carefully calculated coordinates, could match the effectiveness of a single skilled marksman. "It's clever," Major Camden admitted, "using technology and coordination to compensate for lack of individual skill. In theory, it should work." But Mary Cooper had learned more from her father than just marksmanship. The Ghost had taught her that controlling territory was about more than just being able to hit targets at long range. It required an understanding of how the land itself could become your strongest ally. Through her carefully positioned observers, she learned that Blackwood's precise calculations were beginning to show discrepancies. Shots fired according to their mathematical models weren't landing quite where they should. The sophisticated instruments were detecting atmospheric conditions that seemed to change unpredictably. "They don't understand," Howard said quietly, watching the enemy's growing confusion. You haven't just prepared firing positions, you've learned how this land breathes. Mary's preparations had gone beyond simple shooting positions. Over years of careful observation, she'd mapped how wind patterns changed through the valley at different times of day, how heat rising from certain slopes affected air density, how the very shape of the land created atmospheric conditions that no mathematical model could easily predict. Colonel Blackwood's first coordinated attack came at mid-morning. Multiple teams of riflemen, positioned according to their precise calculations, opened fire on what they believed were Mary's key defensive positions. The operation was a masterpiece of military coordination. Carefully timed volleys, systematic coverage of suspected shooting positions, all supported by their network of observers and range-finding equipment. But they were firing at ghosts. Mary's actual positions had been carefully chosen to take advantage of the land's natural deception. Shots that should have been mathematically perfect were being deflected by wind patterns their instruments couldn't accurately measure. Positions that appeared vulnerable on their precise maps proved to have natural advantages that no survey could detect. "Look at their faces," Thomas called softly from his observation post. "The officers checking their calculations, the specialists studying their instruments. They can't understand why their perfect system isn't working." Major Camden, watching through his own field glasses, saw the moment when doubt began to spread through Blackwood's operation. This is what breaks military units, not defeat, but uncertainty. When your training and technology fail you, when the very ground seems to fight against you. But Mary knew this was just the beginning. Colonel Blackwood hadn't survived the war by giving up easily. Through her observation network, she could see him gathering his officers, adapting his strategy. The rail company had more resources, more technology and more men to bring to bear. The quiet farmer's widow was about to show them why her father's reputation had been built on more than just exceptional shooting. The ghost of the plains had understood that true mastery of territory came from something deeper than skill or technology. It came from learning to read the land itself, from understanding secrets that no instrument could measure. Colonel Blackwood's changing tactics, Jacob reported, returning from his concealed observation post near the enemy lines. "They're bringing in some kind of specialized ammunition, custom-made brass cartridges, different from their standard rounds." Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she processed this information. Through her telescope, she could see teams of armorers carefully preparing the new ammunition, using precision tools to measure powder charges and seat bullets with scientific accuracy. Match-grade rounds, Howard identified them, his expertise, showing custom-loaded for specific distances and conditions. They're trying to eliminate variables one by one. Major Camden studied the enemy's preparations with professional interest. "Look at how they're organizing their firing teams now. Each position has a spotter with advanced optics, a dedicated rangefinder, and multiple riflemen. They're creating integrated shooting platforms." But what concerned Mary most was the arrival of new specialists in Blackwood's camp. Men in civilian clothes but with military bearing, carrying leather cases filled with scientific instruments she didn't recognize. "Ballistics experts from the East Coast," Sarah reported, her network of informants proving invaluable. "They're setting up some kind of experimental equipment, something about measuring atmospheric conditions at different elevations simultaneously." Thomas Weber, watching from another observation point, noted something significant. The survey teams are laying out grids with copper wire, creating some kind of measuring system across the whole valley. "Electromagnetic surveying," Major Camden explained. "New technology developed for artillery targeting. They're trying to create a three-dimensional model of the entire battlefield." Howard Hawthorne's weathered face showed grudging respect for the sophistication of Blackwood's approach. "He's not just trying to outshoot us, he's attempting to eliminate the very advantages that terrain and atmosphere give to skilled marksmen." Through her carefully positioned observers, Mary learned that the rail company's scientific approach was expanding beyond mere shooting. Teams of meteorologists were establishing weather stations at multiple points throughout the valley, while geologists take core samples from key positions. "They're going beyond simple range finding," Major Camden observed. "This is a complete scientific analysis of the battlefield. Blackwood's trying to understand and counter every natural advantage we might use." But what the colonel and his specialists didn't realize was that their very precision was revealing their fundamental misunderstanding. While they focused on measuring and quantifying every aspect of the environment, they were missing the subtle interplay of factors that Mary had learned through years of patient observation. "Notice how the morning mist moves through that draw," she instructed Jacob, teaching even as they prepared for battle. "When it curls like that, it means the upper winds are shifting. No instrument can predict it, but the land tells you if you know how to read the signs." Colonel Blackwood's next attack demonstrated his evolving strategy. His firing teams now operated in coordinated groups, each supported by multiple specialists. Range-finders established precise distances, meteorologists provided atmospheric data, and ballistics experts calculated exact firing solutions. The level of coordination was impressive. Each shot was carefully plotted, taking into account every measurable variable. Multiple rifles fired simultaneously at predetermined targets, their timing synchronized through the telegraph network they'd established. But Mary's response revealed the limitations of their scientific approach. Her defenders seemed to anticipate their carefully calculated shots, moving between prepared positions in ways that turned their precise fire into wasted effort. Positions that appeared perfect according to their instruments proved vulnerable to unexpected wind patterns or atmospheric conditions that their measurements hadn't detected. "They're fighting mathematics against experience," Howard observed, watching the enemy's growing frustration through his spyglass. "Trying to reduce to numbers what can only be learned through years of observation." Sarah Chen, returning from another scouting mission, brought news that confirmed their advantage. Their specialists are arguing with each other. The measurements from different instruments don't agree. Some phenomenon they can't explain is affecting their calculations. Mary's preparations had gone beyond simple defensive positions. Over years of managing the farm, she'd altered the landscape in subtle ways, planting trees that affected wind patterns, creating swales that influenced air movement, establishing features that generated microclimates their instruments couldn't accurately measure. "Your father taught you more than just shooting," Major Camden said with growing appreciation. "You've turned environmental knowledge into a defensive weapon." Through her observation network, Mary learned that Colonel Blackwood's scientific approach was facing unexpected challenges. Their sophisticated instruments detected anomalies they couldn't explain. Shots that should have been mathematically perfect were being affected by conditions that defied their careful calculations. "Look at their spotters," Thomas called softly. "Every time they think they've established a perfect firing solution, something changes. The wind shifts unexpectedly, the light plays tricks with their optics, the very air seems to work against them." But Mary knew that Blackwood wouldn't accept defeat easily. His response to these challenges would be to bring in more technology, more specialists, more sophisticated approaches to counter what he saw as merely clever defensive preparations. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to show him why some knowledge couldn't be reduced to measurements and calculations. The ghost of the plains had taught her that true mastery of territory required more than just understanding ballistics and atmospheric science. It required an intimate connection with the land itself, a knowledge that could only be gained through years of patient observation and deep respect for the natural world. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Clearwater Valley as Mary Cooper activated resources that Colonel Blackwood's scientific approach couldn't have anticipated. Through years of quiet preparation, she'd established more than just defensive positions. She'd built a network of allies and supporters throughout the territory. "Riders coming in from the south," Jacob reported from his observation post. "But they're not rail company men. Looks like the Bennett brothers from Thunder Creek, and they're carrying long guns in their saddle scabbards." Mary's network was awakening. The Bennetts were more than just neighboring ranchers. They were former Army scouts who'd learned the art of long-range shooting during the Indian Wars. They'd settled in the territory years ago, drawn by the subtle word that the Ghost's daughter had established a haven for those who understood the true art of territorial control. 3 more groups approaching from different directions, Sarah Chen confirmed, her own network of observers bringing detailed reports. The Martinez family from the High Valley, old Jake Thompson and his sons from the River Bend, and at least 6 riders from the Weber clan. These weren't just farmers and ranchers coming to help a neighbor. Each group brought specialized skills and knowledge that Mary had carefully cultivated over the years. The Martinez family were master gunsmiths who crafted custom ammunition using techniques passed down through generations. Jake Thompson had been a cavalry scout renowned for his ability to read terrain and weather conditions. The Webers were hunters who understood every fold and shadow of the surrounding hills. Colonel Blackwood's noticed, Major Camden observed, through his field glasses. His observers are counting riders, trying to identify the new arrivals. But look, he doesn't seem concerned. He's still focusing on his scientific preparations. Howard Hawthorne studied the enemy's reaction with experienced eyes. Blackwood's making the same mistake others have made. He sees farmers and ranchers, not the skills and knowledge they represent. Through her observation network, Mary learned that the rail company's commander was indeed dismissing the arrival of local settlers as irrelevant to his tactical situation. His focus remained on his sophisticated equipment and specialized teams of experts. But what Blackwood couldn't know was that each new arrival brought more than just another rifle to the defense. The Bennett brothers had spent years mapping the high country's wind patterns, understanding how air currents moved through the valleys in ways no instrument could predict. The Martinez family's custom ammunition was crafted to work with specific terrain features, using knowledge that went beyond simple ballistics. "They're setting up those new range-finding stations," Thomas Weber reported, watching the enemy's continuing preparations. "Fancy brass instruments, all coordinated through their telegraph lines. But notice, they're having trouble getting consistent readings from different positions." Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she integrated the capabilities of her arriving allies. While Blackwood focused on creating a perfect mathematical model of the battlefield, she was implementing something far more sophisticated, a network of observers and shooters who understood the land's hidden rhythms. "Show me what you've mapped," she instructed Jake Thompson, and the old scout unrolled weather-worn charts that showed patterns no scientific instrument could detect. Years of observation had taught him how morning mist predicted afternoon wind shifts, how certain rock formations created atmospheric effects that defied normal calculations. The Martinez family brought their own expertise to the defense. Their patriarch, Miguel Martinez, had studied under European gunsmiths before developing his own techniques for crafting ammunition that worked with, rather than against, natural conditions. "Look at their spotting scopes," Miguel noted, studying the rail company's positions. "Beautiful German optics, perfect for normal conditions. But they don't understand how heat shimmering off these rocks affects their readings." Through her carefully positioned observers, Mary learned that Blackwood's scientific approach was beginning to encounter unexpected complications. His range-finding teams reported anomalies they couldn't explain. Shots that should have been mathematically perfect were being affected by conditions that their instruments failed to detect. "Your network is more than just shooters," Major Camden observed, with growing appreciation. You've gathered people who understand different aspects of territorial control. Each brings knowledge that can't be measured by instruments or reduced to calculations. Howard Hawthorne watched with quiet pride as his daughter coordinated these diverse skills. She hadn't just maintained his teachings about marksmanship, she'd evolved them into something more sophisticated, combining different types of expertise into a complete system of territorial defense. The rail company thinks technology can overcome experience, he noted, studying Blackwood's continuing preparations. They don't understand that true mastery of this land comes from years of patient observation, from knowledge passed down through generations. The afternoon brought new developments as more of Mary's network arrived. The Peterson sisters, who ran a telegraph office in the next county, brought intelligence about the rail company's communications. Their understanding of the territory's information flow would prove crucial in countering Blackwood's coordinated operations. They're using a new military cipher, Rebecca Peterson reported, studying intercepted messages. But they don't realize how the valley's rock formations affect telegraph transmissions. Their signals aren't as secure as they think. Sarah Chen, whose own network extended through the territory's Chinese community, brought reports of rail company supply lines being subtly disrupted. Wagon axles mysteriously weakened, precision instruments damaged in transit, specialized ammunition exposed to conditions that affected its reliability. "Look how they're repositioning their equipment," Thomas called from his observation post. "Every time their measurements don't match expectations, they assume it's an instrument error. They keep moving to new locations, trying to find positions where their calculations work properly. But Mary's most significant advantage lay in how her different allies worked together. The Bennett brothers' understanding of wind patterns complemented the Martinez family's custom ammunition. Jake Thompson's weather prediction skills helped position shooters where they could best use the Weber clan's knowledge of terrain. "Colonel Blackwood's expanding his operation," Major Camden reported, watching through his field glasses. "More specialists arriving, more equipment being set up. He's trying to solve with quantity what he can't achieve with his current approach." Through her observation network, Mary learned that the rail company commander was indeed escalating his scientific effort. New types of measuring devices were being installed, more sophisticated calculations attempted. Blackwood was determined to reduce the defense of Clearwater Valley to a problem that technology could solve. But what he couldn't understand was that Mary's network represented something beyond simple resistance to his modern methods. Each person who arrived brought not just skills, but a deep connection to the land itself. Their knowledge had been earned through years of observation, through success and failure, through patient learning that no quick scientific study could match. "They're bringing in more telegraph equipment," Sarah reported as evening approached, laying cables to coordinate their firing positions. "But look, they're running the lines exactly where the Peterson sisters predicted they would." Mary's tactical mind was already integrating this information. While Blackwood focused on creating a technologically advanced combat system, she was implementing a different kind of coordination, one based on deep understanding of the territory's natural rhythms and hidden strengths. The quiet farmer's widow was about to demonstrate why her father's reputation had been built on more than just exceptional shooting. The Ghost of the Plains had understood that true mastery of territory required a network of skills and knowledge, a combination of different types of expertise that worked together in ways no single approach could match. As the sun set over Clearwater Valley, Mary Cooper prepared to show Colonel Blackwood and the rail company why some challenges couldn't be overcome by mere technology and military science. Her network of allies represented generations of accumulated wisdom about the land itself, knowledge that no instrument could measure, no calculation could predict, and no modern method could easily defeat. The night brought new arrivals that further demonstrated the sophistication of Mary's network. Eleanor Blacksmith rode in from the Cherokee territories to the east. her mixed blood heritage giving her unique insights into reading the land. She'd studied both native tracking techniques and modern ballistics, developing a hybrid approach that bridged different ways of understanding terrain and atmosphere. "Your scientific friends are making a basic mistake," Eleanor observed, studying Blackwood's positions through Mary's telescope. "They're treating the valley like a static problem to be solved. They don't see how it changes, how it breathes with the seasons." Through her observation network, Mary learned that the rail company's command was indeed struggling with unexpected variations in their measurements. Their sophisticated instruments detected changes they couldn't explain. Subtle shifts in air density, wind patterns that seemed to defy normal meteorological principles. "Watch their survey teams," Thomas called softly from his position. "Every time they think they've established accurate baselines, something changes. The very ground seems to fight against their calculations." Howard Hawthorne recognized the growing frustration in the enemy camp. They're facing the same challenge that defeated better men, trying to impose rigid mathematics on a living landscape. But Mary's network brought more than just understanding of the land. The Whitman sisters arrived as darkness fell, bringing crucial intelligence from their printing office in the territorial capital. Their father had been a military cryptographer, and they'd learned to decode complex messages while running their family newspaper. "The rail company's not just coordinating through telegraph," Margaret Whitman reported, "studying intercepted communications. They're using a sophisticated system of visual signals, mirrors, and flag codes, but they don't realize how the valley's unique atmospheric conditions affect their transmissions." Sarah Chen's own network expanded as Chinese railroad workers began subtly undermining Blackwood's operation. Precision instruments were mysteriously misaligned, carefully calculated firing positions found themselves subject to unexplained equipment failures. "Look at their new defensive preparations, Major," Camden observed as midnight approached. "They're setting up elaborate protective positions, trying to shield their equipment from our counterfire, but they're actually making themselves more vulnerable to the land itself." Through careful observation, Mary's allies reported that Blackwood's scientific approach was creating unexpected weaknesses. His precisely arranged equipment positions, chosen for optimal mathematical calculations, often placed delicate instruments where natural conditions would affect their accuracy. "They're fighting the wrong battle," Eleanor Blacksmith noted, her mixed heritage giving her unique perspective. "My Cherokee grandmother used to say that you don't master the land, you learn to work with its spirit. These men with their machines, they're trying to impose their will instead of understanding." The arrival of James Running Deer and his sons from the Dakota Territories added another layer to Mary's defensive network. They brought generations of knowledge about reading subtle signs in nature. How certain birds' flight patterns indicated approaching weather changes, how the behavior of small animals revealed atmospheric conditions that no instrument could detect. "Your father understood this," Running Deer told Mary as they observed Blackwood's continuing preparations. "That's why he sought out our people's knowledge. He knew that true mastery of long-range shooting required understanding things that couldn't be measured by machines." The night deepened, and Mary's network continued to demonstrate its sophistication. The Peterson sisters intercepted more of the rail company's communications, revealing that Blackwood's scientific approach was facing growing internal doubts. His specialists argued over conflicting data, unable to reconcile their precise measurements with actual results. "They're bringing in more experts," Sarah reported, her observers noting new arrivals at the enemy camp. University professors, military scientists, even a German ballistic specialist. But look how they cluster around their instruments, barely even looking at the land they're trying to understand. Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she integrated these reports. While Blackwood gathered more technical expertise, she was implementing a system that combined different ways of reading and understanding the territory. Each of her allies brought not just skills, but a deep connection to the land itself. "Show me what you've observed," she instructed Running Deer's youngest son, and the young man demonstrated how certain grass patterns revealed wind currents that the rail company's instruments couldn't reliably detect. Eleanor Blacksmith added her own insights, showing how shadow patterns across the valley could be used to predict atmospheric changes. Through the night, Mary's network continued to prove its worth. The Martinez family worked with Eleanor and Running Deer, combining their gunsmithing expertise with traditional knowledge to create ammunition that worked in harmony with the land's natural conditions. The Bennett brothers integrated the Peterson sisters' intelligence about enemy communications into their positioning strategies. "Look how they keep adjusting their equipment," Thomas called softly as dawn approached. "Every time they think they've solved one problem, another appears. They can't understand why their perfect mathematical models keep failing." Major Camden, watching through his field glasses, saw the moment when frustration began to show in Blackwood's command. This is what breaks military discipline. Not defeat in battle, but the gradual realization that your fundamental approach might be wrong. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to demonstrate why her father's legacy involved more than just exceptional marksmanship. The ghost of the plains had understood that true mastery of territory required a network of different skills and insights, a combination of knowledge that went beyond any single approach to understanding the land. As the first light of dawn painted Clearwater Valley in shades of pearl and gold, Mary Cooper and her allies prepared to show Colonel Blackwood why some challenges couldn't be overcome by mere technology and military science. They represented generations of accumulated wisdom about the land itself, a deep understanding that no instrument could measure, no calculation could predict, and no modern method could easily defeat. The dawn light revealed significant changes in Colonel Blackwood's operation. Mary Cooper, observing through her father's telescope, watched as new wagons arrived bearing equipment she'd never seen before. Heavy wooden crates were being unloaded under the supervision of a tall figure in civilian clothes, but with unmistakable military bearing. Major General Philip Hawthorne, Howard identified the newcomer, his voice carrying a hint of old tension. "My younger brother. I wondered if Blackwood would call him in." Mary studied her uncle's movements with professional interest. She'd never met this branch of the family. They'd chosen different sides during the war, leading to a bitter split. While her father had become the ghost of the plains, Philip had pursued a career in military science, specializing in advanced warfare techniques. "He's brought the latest Army experimental equipment," Major Camden reported, his military contacts proving valuable. "Prototype range-finding systems, new types of optical devices. Some of it isn't even in general service yet." Through her observation network, Mary learned that General Hawthorne's arrival marked a significant escalation in the rail company's approach. He wasn't just bringing new technology, he was implementing an entirely new system of combat coordination. "Look at how they're repositioning their forces," Thomas Weber called from his observation post. "Not just establishing new firing positions, they're creating what the Prussians called a combat grid. Every position supports the others, all coordinated through those new signal devices." Sarah Chen's observers reported more concerning developments. Teams of specialists were setting up what appeared to be a complete tactical operations center, with maps, calculating machines, and a sophisticated communications network. "They're not just trying to outshoot us anymore," Eleanor Blacksmith noted, her mixed heritage giving her unique insight into different approaches to warfare. "They're attempting to create a perfect system of control, one that can predict and counter every possible response." General Hawthorne's first action was to reorganize Blackwood's entire operation. The ad hoc collection of specialists and hired guns was being transformed into a disciplined military unit. Each team was assigned specific roles, their actions coordinated through a precise chain of command. Notice their new equipment placement, Howard instructed, studying the enemy's preparations. Philip always was methodical. He's establishing multiple layers of observation and control. Each position covers potential blind spots in the others. Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she understood her uncle's strategy. He wasn't just trying to overcome her defensive advantages. He was attempting to create an entirely new approach to territorial control, one that combined military discipline with cutting-edge technology. Through carefully placed sources, she learned that General Hawthorne had brought more than just new equipment. Special teams of military scientists were establishing atmospheric monitoring stations throughout the valley. Complex instruments measured temperature gradients, air pressure, variations and wind patterns at multiple elevations. They're creating what the general calls a predictive combat environment, Major Camden explained, interpreting intercepted communications. Using scientific data to anticipate and counter every possible tactical advantage we might have. But what Philip Hawthorne couldn't know was that his niece had anticipated even this level of escalation. While he focused on creating a perfect system of military control, Mary was implementing something more sophisticated, a defense that worked with the land's natural rhythms rather than trying to predict them. Your uncle's making the same mistake. He made in the war, Howard observed, watching the enemy's preparations, believing that enough technology and organization can overcome any obstacle. The morning brought new developments as General Hawthorne's system took shape. Teams of surveyors established precise geometric patterns across the valley, marking positions with metal stakes connected by copper wire. Complex instruments were mounted at key points, all feeding data back to the central command post. They're attempting to create a mathematical model of reality, Eleanor commented, watching the elaborate preparations. But the land doesn't work that way. It's alive, always changing in ways that numbers can't capture. Through her network, Mary learned that her uncle's approach was already encountering unexpected challenges. The sophisticated instruments detected anomalies they couldn't explain, atmospheric conditions that defied normal patterns, terrain effects that seemed to change unpredictably. "Look at their faces," Thomas called softly from his position. The scientists checking their calculations, the officers studying their maps. They know something's wrong, but they can't understand what. Sarah Chen, whose observers had infiltrated closer to the enemy camp, brought reports of growing tension between General Hawthorne's military precision and Colonel Blackwood's more practical experience. The two commanders argued over strategy, their different approaches creating friction in the operation. "They're facing an eternal military problem," Major Camden noted with professional interest. "The conflict between theoretical perfection and practical reality." But Philip Hawthorne wasn't easily deterred. Mary's telescope revealed new equipment being deployed, even more advanced optical systems, experimental range-finding devices, and what appeared to be early versions of mechanical calculating machines. "He's trying to remove human judgment from the equation," Howard explained, recognizing his brother's methodology. "Create a system so precise, so technically perfect, that individual skill becomes irrelevant." Through careful observation, Mary's allies reported that the general's scientific approach was expanding beyond mere combat operations. Teams of geologists took soil samples and rock cores, while meteorologists established a network of weather monitoring stations. Every aspect of the environment was being studied, measured, and analyzed. "They're not just fighting us," Eleanor observed. "They're trying to conquer the land itself, bend it to their will through scientific understanding." Running Deer and his sons, watching from carefully concealed positions, noted subtle changes in the valley's natural patterns. Animals behaved differently around the new equipment. Birds altered their flight paths. Even the morning mist moved in ways that seemed to defy the scientists' predictions. "The land knows," Running Deer said simply. "It responds to those who try to dominate it rather than understand it." General Hawthorne's next phase revealed the true sophistication of his approach. Mary's observers reported the arrival of cutting-edge European military technology, experimental breech-loading rifles with advanced sighting systems, new types of explosive ammunition, and even early versions of automatic weapons. "He's not just escalating technologically," Major Camden warned, studying the new weapons. "He's changing the entire nature of the conflict. These aren't just tools for precision shooting. They're designed for area denial and systematic suppression." But Mary Cooper had learned more from her father than just marksmanship. The Ghost of the Plains had taught her that true mastery of territory required understanding not just how to fight, but when to let the land itself become your strongest ally. As the morning progressed, General Hawthorne's perfect system began to encounter more complications. His precision instruments detected atmospheric anomalies they couldn't explain. Carefully calculated firing solutions proved ineffective against positions that seemed to shift with the changing light. The very ground appeared to work against their elaborate preparations. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to show her uncle why some knowledge couldn't be reduced to mathematical models or controlled through military discipline. The defense of Clearwater Valley would demonstrate that true understanding of territory came not from trying to dominate the land, but from learning to work in harmony with its natural rhythms. "More specialists arriving," Sarah reported as midday approached. "But these are different. They're carrying photographic equipment, some kind of new scientific cameras." Through her telescope, Mary studied the newcomers with growing concern. The rail company wasn't just bringing in military technology anymore. They were implementing what appeared to be an entirely new approach to battlefield analysis. Chronophotographic sequencing, Major Camden identified the equipment. Developed by European military researchers, they use multiple cameras to capture and analyze motion in precise detail. "Your uncle's trying to document and predict every aspect of our defensive operations." Howard Hawthorne watched his brother's methodical preparations with grim understanding. Philip always believed that enough analysis could solve any problem. During the war, he developed entire systems for predicting troop movements based on mathematical models. The new scientific teams set up their equipment at carefully measured intervals around the valley. Complex arrays of cameras and timing devices were synchronized through the telegraph network, creating what General Hawthorne called a complete tactical observation system. "Look how they're positioning the camera stations," Thomas called from his observation post. "Each one covers specific zones, all coordinated to capture any movement in their targeted areas." Eleanor Blacksmith, studying the enemy's preparations through borrowed field glasses, noted something significant. "They're not just photographing the visible landscape. Those devices have special lenses. They're trying to capture heat patterns, atmospheric distortions, anything that might reveal our hidden positions." Through her network, Mary learned that her uncle's scientific approach went beyond mere observation. Teams of analysts were establishing what he called a predictive combat laboratory, where photographic evidence would be combined with atmospheric data and ballistic calculations to create a complete model of the battlefield. The general's implementing something he developed near the end of the war, Major Camden explained, interpreting intercepted communications. He calls it systematic terrain dominance, using technology to eliminate any possible tactical advantage terrain might provide. Sarah Chen's observers reported that the new approach was already changing how the rail company's forces operated. Instead of relying on individual skill or experience, every action was now being guided by precise scientific analysis. Teams of specialists studied photographic sequences, measuring and calculating every aspect of potential defensive positions. They're trying to turn combat into a purely technical problem, Howard observed, watching the methodical operation unfold. Remove human judgment and natural intuition from the equation entirely. But what General Hawthorne couldn't know was that his niece had anticipated even this level of technological escalation. While he focused on creating perfect scientific models, Mary was implementing strategies that worked with the land's inherent unpredictability. Running deer's suns, moving like shadows through the valley's hidden paths, reported that the enemy's elaborate camera systems were already encountering unexpected difficulties. Heat shimmer from certain rock formations created distortions in their photographic records, natural phenomena that their instruments detected couldn't be properly analyzed or predicted. The land speaks in its own language, Running Deer said, quietly watching the scientists struggle with their equipment. These men with their machines, they hear the words but miss the meaning. The afternoon brought new developments as General Hawthorne expanded his operation. Teams of military engineers began constructing what appeared to be permanent observation posts, fortified positions equipped with the latest scientific instruments and connected through an elaborate communication network. He's not just planning for a quick victory, Major Camden warned, studying the enemy's preparations. Your uncle's establishing a complete system of territorial control. Once it's in place, he believes no conventional defense could possibly succeed. Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she understood the full implications of this escalation. The rail company wasn't just trying to defeat her defensive positions. They were attempting to create an entirely new approach to controlling territory, one that would make traditional skills and knowledge obsolete. Through careful observation, her allies reported that General Hawthorne's scientific system was becoming increasingly complex. Each new layer of technology and analysis seemed to require additional specialists and equipment to support it. The operation was expanding geometrically, becoming more elaborate with each attempt to perfect their approach. Watch their supply lines, Thomas called softly from his position. Every time they encounter something they can't explain, they bring in more equipment, more experts, more sophisticated instruments. Eleanor Blacksmith, whose mixed heritage gave her unique insight into different ways of understanding the land, saw the fundamental flaw in their approach. They're trying to solve with complexity what can only be understood through simplicity, adding more layers of analysis when what they need is deeper understanding. The rail company's scientific teams continued to establish their elaborate observation network, but Mary's defenders had already begun implementing countermeasures that no camera could capture, no instrument could measure. The very sophistication of General Hawthorne's approach was becoming its greatest weakness. Your uncle's perfect system has a critical vulnerability, Howard explained, watching the operation through his spyglass. The more complex it becomes, the more dependent it is on everything working exactly as planned. One unexpected variable, one natural phenomenon they can't predict, and the entire structure begins to unravel. As evening approached, Mary Cooper prepared to demonstrate why her father's teachings involved more than just exceptional marksmanship. The Ghost of the Plains had understood that true mastery of territory required working with the land's natural tendencies rather than trying to impose artificial control through technology and analysis. The quiet farmer's widow watched the sun setting behind her uncle's elaborate scientific operation, knowing that the real battle would be fought not between opposing technologies or competing systems, but between fundamentally different ways of understanding and working with the land itself. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded Clearwater Valley as Mary Cooper implemented her response to General Hawthorne's technological escalation, while her uncle's scientific teams worked by artificial light, setting up their elaborate equipment. Mary's defenders moved like ghosts through the landscape they knew intimately. They've established their primary observation grid, Eleanor Blacksmith reported, returning from a night scouting mission. But they've made a crucial mistake. All their calculations assume stable atmospheric conditions. They haven't accounted for how the valley's temperature patterns shift at dawn. Mary's tactical mind was already formulating a response that went beyond simple countermeasures. Through years of careful observation, she'd learned how the land itself could become an active participant in any conflict. "Show me what you've prepared," she instructed Miguel Martinez, and the master gunsmith revealed modifications he'd made to their ammunition. Working through the night, he'd crafted specialized rounds designed not just for accuracy, but to work in harmony with the valley's natural conditions. Each cartridge is matched to specific positions and times of day, Miguel explained, showing how he'd varied powder charges and bullet weights. When the morning air shifts, when the heat begins to rise from certain rocks, these will perform differently than any mathematical model could predict. Through her observation network, Mary learned that General Hawthorne's scientific approach was already encountering unexpected complications. His chronophotographic arrays, designed to capture and analyze every movement in the valley, were producing images that his specialists couldn't properly interpret. "Look at their command center," Thomas called softly from his position. "The analysts are arguing over their data. The same terrain features appear differently in sequential photographs, showing variations their instruments can't explain." Sarah Chen's observers reported growing tension between the general's theoretical approach and Colonel Blackwood's practical experience. The military scientists insisted their calculations were perfect, while the field commanders noticed their carefully plotted firing solutions consistently failing to achieve predicted results. "Your uncle's made a fundamental error," Howard noted, studying the enemy's operations through his spyglass. "He's trying to impose a rigid system on a living landscape. The more precise his measurements become, the more obvious the discrepancies appear." Mary's counter-strategy involved more than just exploiting natural phenomena. Running Deer and his sons had spent the night establishing what they called spirit lines, pathways through the terrain that seemed to defy normal tactical analysis. "The Old Ones knew these secrets," Running Deer explained, showing how certain approaches appeared exposed according to military doctrine but actually provided perfect concealment when used properly. "The land offers protection to those who understand its true nature." The first light of dawn revealed the sophistication of Mary's response. While General Hawthorne's teams worked to perfect their scientific system, her defenders had implemented something far more subtle. Each position supported the others, not through mathematical coordination, but through deep understanding of how the valley's natural rhythms could be used to tactical advantage. "They're adjusting their camera positions again," Eleanor reported, watching the enemy's continuing preparations. "Every time the light changes, their photographic evidence shows something different. They can't establish the stable baseline their system requires." Major Camden, studying the rail company's operations with professional interest, noted how their elaborate technological approach was becoming increasingly cumbersome. Each attempt to perfect their measurements requires more equipment, more specialists, more complex calculations. They're creating a system too sophisticated for its own good. Through carefully placed observers, Mary learned that her uncle's scientific teams were detecting patterns they couldn't explain. Their instruments showed atmospheric conditions that seemed to change without cause, terrain features that affected ballistics in ways their calculations couldn't predict. "Watch their range-finding teams," Thomas called from his position. "Every time they think they've established perfect firing solutions, something changes. The very air seems to work against their precision." The Martinez family had spent the night preparing specialized ammunition for different phases of Mary's counter-strategy. Each round was crafted not just for accuracy, but to demonstrate why simple ballistic calculations couldn't account for all variables in long-range shooting. "These will behave differently in morning air than afternoon heat," Miguel explained, showing how he'd varied bullet weights and powder charges. No mathematical model can predict exactly how they'll perform, but someone who understands the land can use them perfectly. Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she integrated reports from her network. While General Hawthorne focused on creating a perfect system of observation and control, she was implementing something far more sophisticated, a defense that used the valley's natural tendencies to undermine his scientific approach. "Your uncle believes in systems," Howard observed, watching the enemy's methodical preparations. "But he never learned what I taught you. That true mastery of territory comes from understanding its living nature, not trying to reduce it to mathematics." The morning brought new developments, as General Hawthorne's operation encountered more unexpected challenges. His chronophotographic arrays detected movement they couldn't explain, atmospheric effects that seemed to defy their careful calculations. The very precision of their instruments was revealing discrepancies they couldn't resolve. Through her telescope, Mary watched the growing frustration in the enemy camp. Teams of specialists argued over conflicting data, while military scientists struggled to explain why their perfect calculations failed to match observed results. "They're fighting the wrong battle," Eleanor noted, her mixed heritage giving her unique insight. "All their technology, all their science, it's making them more vulnerable to the land's natural power, not less." The rail company's response to these challenges was to add more layers of technological sophistication. New instruments were deployed, more complex calculations attempted, but each addition to their system created new vulnerabilities, more points where theory failed to match reality. "Look how they're repositioning their equipment," Sarah reported as the morning progressed. "Every time they think they've solved one problem, another appears. They're caught in a cycle of endless adjustment and recalculation." Mary's counter-strategy was revealing its true sophistication. While General Hawthorne's teams struggled to perfect their scientific approach, her defenders were demonstrating why some knowledge couldn't be reduced to mathematical models or captured by even the most advanced technology. The quiet farmers. Widow was about to show her uncle that true mastery of territory required more than just advanced equipment and precise calculations. The defense of Clearwater Valley would prove that understanding the land's natural rhythms was more powerful than any attempt to impose artificial control through technology and military science. New equipment arriving, Jacob reported from his observation post. Strange-looking brass devices with glass tubes. The scientists are handling them like they're precious. Through her father's telescope, Mary studied these latest additions to her uncle's arsenal. The instruments appeared to be experimental atmospheric measuring devices, more sophisticated than anything she'd seen before. Differential barometric analyzers, Major Camden identified them. Latest European military technology. They're designed to create three-dimensional maps of air pressure and temperature variations. Your uncle's trying to model the valley's atmospheric conditions completely. But what General Hawthorne couldn't know was that Mary's counter-strategy had already anticipated this level of scientific escalation. The Whitman sisters, using their knowledge of military communications, had intercepted detailed specifications of the new equipment. "These devices have critical vulnerabilities," Margaret Whitman explained, showing Mary the decoded documents. "They require absolutely stable mounting positions and precise calibration. Any slight variation in their setup makes their readings unreliable." Eleanor Blacksmith, whose understanding bridged different ways of knowing the land, saw immediately how this could be used to their advantage. The very places they need to position their instruments, the points that give the best mathematical coverage of the valley, are exactly where the ground's natural movement will affect them most. Through her observation network, Mary learned that the rail company's scientific teams were indeed struggling with unexpected equipment problems. Their precise instruments, designed for controlled laboratory conditions, were producing erratic readings in the valley's dynamic environment. "Watch their calibration teams," Thomas called softly. "Every time they think they've established accurate baselines, something changes. The ground shifts slightly, the air moves differently, and their perfect measurements become unstable." Sarah Chen's observers reported growing discord between different groups in the enemy camp. The military scientists insisted their instruments were functioning correctly, while experienced field commanders noticed increasing discrepancies between calculated predictions and actual conditions. "Your uncle's created a perfect theoretical system," Howard observed, studying the operation through his spyglass. "But he's forgotten that reality doesn't always conform to theory, no matter how precise the calculations." Mary's counter-strategy involved more than just exploiting the limitations of the enemy's technology. Running Deer and his sons had spent the night implementing what they called Earth medicine, subtle alterations to the landscape that worked with its natural tendencies to affect atmospheric conditions in ways no instrument could reliably measure. "The old ones understood these things," Running Deer explained, showing how certain arrangements of stones and earth could influence air currents and temperature patterns. Not as science to be measured, but as living forces to be worked with. The Martinez family had integrated this traditional knowledge into their ammunition crafting. Miguel demonstrated how different combinations of powder and bullet weight could interact with these natural effects, creating performance patterns that defied standard ballistic calculations. "Each cartridge is like a key," he explained, showing Mary the subtle variations in his hand-loaded rounds. "Not just matched to distance and wind, but to how the land itself breathes at different times of day." Through carefully positioned observers, Mary learned that General Hawthorne's scientific approach was becoming increasingly brittle. The more precisely they tried to measure and control conditions, the more vulnerable they became to natural variations they couldn't predict or understand. "Look at their command center," Eleanor called softly. "The analysts are adding more variables to their calculations, trying to account for every discrepancy they detect. But each new factor they include makes their whole system more complex, more likely to fail." The morning light revealed new aspects of Mary's sophisticated response. While her uncle's teams struggled to perfect their measurements, her defenders demonstrated an entirely different approach to mastering long-range combat. Each position supported the others not through mathematical coordination, but through deep understanding of how natural forces could be used to tactical advantage. "They're fighting ghosts," Thomas observed, watching the enemy's growing frustration. "Every time they think they've established perfect firing solutions, the very conditions they're trying to measure seem to shift beneath them." Major Camden, whose military experience helped him appreciate both approaches, saw the fundamental conflict unfolding. "This isn't just about technology versus tradition anymore. It's about two completely different ways of understanding and controlling territory." Through her father's telescope, Mary watched as her uncle's perfect system began to encounter more serious complications. The very precision of their instruments was becoming a weakness, detecting variations and anomalies that their scientific models couldn't explain or incorporate. "Your brother always believed in the power of precise measurement," Howard told her, remembering old arguments with his sibling. "But he never understood that some things can't be reduced to numbers and calculations. The land has its own wisdom, its own way of responding to those who try to dominate it." The quiet farmer's widow prepared to demonstrate why her father's legacy involved more than just exceptional marksmanship. The ghost of the plains had taught her that true mastery of territory required understanding it as a living thing, not just a problem to be solved through technology and mathematics. As the morning progressed, Mary Cooper and her allies continued to reveal why some knowledge couldn't be captured by even the most sophisticated instruments or reduced to mathematical formulas. The defense of Clearwater Valley would prove that working in harmony with the land's natural rhythms was more powerful than any attempt to impose artificial control through science and military doctrine. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across Clearwater Valley as new revelations began to emerge. Margaret Whitman arrived at Mary's farmhouse with intercepted telegrams that revealed a deeper layer to the conflict. The rail company's push for her land wasn't just about the railway pass. It was part of a larger military strategy. "Look at these messages," Margaret explained, spreading decoded papers across the kitchen table. "They're not just building a railroad. They're establishing what they call strategic control points across multiple territories. Each position they've seized sits at a crucial junction of proposed military supply routes." Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she understood the broader implications. Through her telescope, she studied her uncle's elaborate scientific operation with new understanding. The rail company wasn't just a civilian enterprise. It was acting as an advance force for future military expansion. The chronophotographic arrays, the atmospheric measuring stations, Major Camden noted, examining the telegrams. They're not just for controlling this valley, they're testing a new system of territorial domination that could be implemented across the entire frontier. Howard Hawthorne's weathered face showed grim recognition. This explains why Philip's involved. He's not just helping the rail company. He's developing new methods of controlling vast territories through technology and scientific measurement. Through her observation network, Mary learned that General Hawthorne's operation in Clearwater Valley was being closely watched by military observers from several nations. The rail company's push for her land had become a testing ground for new approaches to territorial control. "Foreign military attachés arriving," Sarah Chen reported, her observers noting new figures in the enemy camp. "British, German, even a Russian officer. They're here to evaluate your uncle's methods." Thomas Weber, watching from his concealed position, spotted something significant. The survey teams. They're not just mapping the valley anymore. They're establishing what we called control points in the European wars, positions from which entire regions can be dominated through coordinated fire. Eleanor Blacksmith, whose mixed heritage gave her unique insight into different ways of understanding territory, saw the pattern emerging. They're not just fighting for one piece of land. They're trying to create a new kind of warfare, where technology and science replace traditional knowledge and skill. The Martinez family, examining their gunsmithing records, found evidence that similar attempts at technological control had been tried before. Miguel's grandfather had documented earlier conflicts where advanced military technology had failed. Against those who truly understood the land. "Look at these old accounts," Miguel showed Mary, pointing to carefully preserved notes. "The same pattern repeats. They bring in new weapons, new methods, thinking they can overcome traditional knowledge through superior technology. But they never learn the land's deeper lessons." Through carefully placed sources, Mary learned that her uncle's scientific approach was part of a larger military doctrine he'd been developing since the war. The rail company's expansion was providing cover for establishing a network of technologically controlled strongpoints across the frontier. "These aren't just survey markers," Major Camden explained, studying captured documents. "They're laying the groundwork for a complete system of territorial control. Each position they secure becomes part of a larger network, all coordinated through their new scientific methods. But what General Hawthorne and his military observers couldn't know was that Mary's defense of Clearwater Valley had implications far beyond their scientific calculations. Her network of allies represented not just resistance to the rail company, but the preservation of crucial knowledge about the land itself. "Show them what you've discovered," she instructed Running Deer, and the old hunter revealed patterns in the valley's natural behavior that no instrument could detect. Subtle signs that predicted weather changes, invisible pathways that affected wind and temperature, knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of careful observation. The land speaks to those who know how to listen, Running Deer explained, demonstrating how certain natural features created effects that defied standard military doctrine. These men with their machines, they hear only echoes of its true voice. The Whitman sisters, continuing to decode intercepted communications, uncovered more layers of the broader strategy. The rail company's push wasn't just about controlling transportation. They were establishing what military planners called strategic depth, creating a network of positions that could control movement and resources across entire territories. "Look at these construction plans," Margaret showed Mary, pointing to technical drawings hidden among routine rail company documents. "These aren't just railway stations they're building. They're disguised fortifications, designed to house military equipment and personnel." Sarah Chen's observers reported that General Hawthorne's operation was already being studied as a model for future military operations. Officers from different armies made careful notes, watching how his scientific approach attempted to overcome traditional defensive advantages through technology and precise measurement. "They're not just fighting us," Thomas called softly from his position. "They're trying to prove that their new methods can replace old skills entirely, make traditional knowledge obsolete through scientific advancement." But Mary's defense of Clearwater Valley was demonstrating something far more significant than mere resistance to technological dominance. Her network of allies was showing why some knowledge couldn't be replaced by instruments or reduced to mathematical formulas. "Your uncle's made a crucial mistake," Howard observed, watching the foreign officers study the operation through their field glasses. "He thinks he's just testing new military methods. He doesn't realize he's challenging something far more fundamental, the very way people understand and relate to the land itself." Through her father's telescope, Mary studied the growing complexity of the enemy's operation. Each new layer of technology, each attempt to perfect their scientific system, only revealed more clearly why some things couldn't be controlled through mere measurement and calculation. "They're fighting the wrong battle," Eleanor noted, watching the military observers make their detailed notes. "All their science, all their planning, it's based on seeing the land as something to be conquered and controlled. They don't understand. The true mastery comes from working with its natural patterns, not against them." The midday heat brought new revelations as Mary's network uncovered more evidence of the broader conflict unfolding. The rail company's push for her land wasn't just about one valley or one railway line. It represented a fundamental clash between different ways of understanding and controlling territory. "Your resistance means more than you know," Major Camden told her, studying the latest intercepted communications. "You're not just defending your farm. You're protecting a kind of knowledge that their new methods would destroy completely if they succeeded." Through careful observation, Mary's allies reported that General Hawthorne's scientific approach was revealing its limitations in unexpected ways. The very precision of their measurements, the complexity of their calculations, was making them vulnerable to aspects of the land's behavior that couldn't be reduced to numbers or predicted by instruments. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to demonstrate why her father's legacy involved more than just extraordinary marksmanship. The Ghost of the Plains had understood that true mastery of territory required preserving knowledge that went beyond technology or military science. Wisdom about the land itself that could only be gained through generations of careful observation and deep respect for its natural patterns. "More communications intercepted," Rebecca Whitman reported, arriving with fresh intelligence. "They're not just sharing technical data with foreign militaries. There are references to something called Project Horizon, plans for implementing this control system across the entire western frontier." Through her observation network, Mary learned that General Hawthorne's operation had implications beyond even military expansion. The rail company's directors were meeting with government officials, discussing how their scientific approach to territorial control could be used for broader purposes. "Look at these engineering diagrams," Sarah Chen showed Mary, her contacts having secured documents from the rail company's main office. "These aren't just railway routes. They're planning a network of observation posts, all equipped with the latest scientific instruments. Every major valley, every strategic passage would be under constant surveillance." Major Camden studied the plans with growing concern. "This goes beyond military strategy. They're trying to create a new kind of frontier, one where every movement, every position can be monitored and controlled through technological means." Howard Hawthorne recognized elements of his brother's long-term vision in the plans. Philip always talked about this, even before the war. He believed that enough technology, enough scientific understanding could eliminate the uncertainty that traditional skills relied upon. The afternoon brought new revelations as Mary's allies uncovered more layers of the broader strategy. The Whitman sisters decoded messages revealing that foreign investors were already committed to expanding the system, seeing it as a way to control vast territories without requiring the deep knowledge that traditional methods demanded. "These aren't just military observers," Thomas called softly from his position, watching the foreign officers examine General Hawthorne's operation. "They represent industrial consortiums, banking interests. They're planning to replicate this system wherever traditional ways of living resist their expansion." Eleanor Blacksmith, studying the enemy's preparations through borrowed field glasses, saw the cultural implications. "They're not just fighting against our defense of this valley. They're trying to eliminate a whole way of understanding and living with the land." Through carefully placed sources, Mary learned that her uncle's scientific approach was being considered as a model for controlling not just territories, but the very way people related to the land. The rail company's directors spoke of modernizing frontier life, replacing traditional knowledge with technological systems. "Watch their specialists," Running Deer instructed his sons, pointing out how the enemy's scientific teams moved through the landscape. "They see only what their instruments tell them. They've forgotten how to read the land's own signs." The Martinez family, examining their records of ammunition performance in different conditions, found patterns that highlighted the fundamental conflict. Miguel showed Mary how their handcrafted rounds, designed to work with natural conditions, achieved results that the enemy's precise calculations couldn't explain. "Each bullet tells a story," he explained, demonstrating subtle variations in powder loads and bullet design. "Not just about distance and wind, but about how the land itself affects their flight. This is knowledge their instruments can't capture." Through her father's telescope, Mary studied the growing sophistication of her uncle's operation. Each new layer of technology, each attempt to perfect their scientific control, only revealed more clearly why some understanding couldn't be reduced to measurements and formulas. "The foreign officers are documenting everything," Sarah reported as evening approached. "Not just the technical details, but how this system could be used to control any territory where traditional knowledge gives defenders an advantage." Major Camden, whose military experience helped him see the broader implications, recognized what was really at stake. This isn't just about one valley or one railway line. It's about whether technology and science can completely replace traditional ways of understanding and living with the land. Mary's defense of Clearwater Valley was becoming a test case for something far more significant than mere resistance to progress. Her network of allies represented the preservation of knowledge that couldn't be replicated by instruments or replaced by calculations. "Your uncle thinks he's creating the future," Howard told her, watching the enemy's elaborate preparations. But he's forgotten that true advancement comes from building on wisdom that's been earned through generations of careful observation and deep respect for the land's natural ways. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to show why her father's legacy had to be preserved. The ghost of the plains had understood that mastery of territory wasn't just about controlling space through technology or force. It was about maintaining knowledge that connected people to the land in ways that no scientific system could replace. The evening light painted Clearwater Valley in shades of amber and gold as a critical shift in the conflict began to unfold. Through her father's telescope, Mary Cooper watched an unexpected arrival at General Hawthorne's camp, a civilian wagon carrying what appeared to be unusual cargo. "That's Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne," Howard identified the newcomer with surprise. "Philip's daughter. Last I heard, she was working at the Smithsonian Institution, studying atmospheric sciences." Mary studied with her cousin with professional interest. Elizabeth moved with precision among her father's scientific equipment, but there was something different in her approach, a hesitation, a questioning look as she examined the elaborate technological array. "She's not just checking their instruments," Major Camden observed, watching through his field glasses. "She's comparing their measurements with some kind of independent calculations, and she doesn't look pleased with what she's finding." Through her observation network, Mary learned that Elizabeth Hawthorne's arrival marked a crucial turning point. The young scientist had been tracking her father's project from Washington, noting discrepancies that the military observers had overlooked. "Look at these readings," Sarah Chen reported, her contacts having overheard Elizabeth's heated discussion with the scientific teams. "She's discovered patterns they can't explain, variations that shouldn't exist according to their mathematical models." Thomas Weber, watching from his concealed position, noted something significant in the newcomer's behavior. The way she moves through the camp, studying everything. She's not just checking calculations, she's looking at the land itself, noticing things their instruments aren't detecting. Eleanor Blacksmith saw it too, her mixed heritage giving her unique insight into different ways of understanding natural phenomena. She has both kinds of sight, the scientist's precision, and something else, something deeper. She sees what their measurements are missing. Through carefully placed sources, Mary learned that Elizabeth's arrival had created tension in the enemy camp. The young scientist's questions challenged fundamental assumptions in her father's approach, pointing out ways their sophisticated system failed to account for the land's actual behavior. "Your cousin's different from her father," Howard observed, studying Elizabeth's methodical investigation. "Philip sees only what his instruments tell him. She's noticing the gaps between their measurements and reality." The turning point came as Elizabeth began conducting her own experiments, separate from the military operation. She set up simple observational posts away from the elaborate equipment, making careful notes about natural phenomena that the sophisticated instruments seemed to overlook. "Watch how she's documenting the evening air movements," Running Deer instructed his sons. "Not with machines, but with her eyes and senses. She's beginning to read the land's own language." Mary's tactical assessment shifted as she understood the implications of her cousin's presence. Elizabeth wasn't just investigating discrepancies in the scientific data. She was discovering why some knowledge couldn't be captured by even the most advanced technology. The Martinez family, observing from their positions, reported that Elizabeth had taken special interest in their custom ammunitions performance. The young scientist spent hours analyzing how handcrafted rounds achieved results that defied standard ballistic calculations. "She's starting to understand," Miguel noted, watching Elizabeth's growing fascination. "Each bullet's flight tells a story about the air, the light, the very breath of the valley. These are things no instrument can fully measure." Through her father's telescope, Mary watched as Elizabeth's investigation began to affect the entire operation. The young scientist's questions created ripples of doubt among the technical teams, challenging their confidence in the perfect system they tried to create. "Your brother's facing a choice," Howard told Mary, watching General Hawthorne's reaction to his daughter's findings. "Elizabeth's discoveries threaten everything he believes about controlling territory through technology." Alone, Major Camden, whose military experience helped him appreciate the significance of this moment, saw how Elizabeth's presence was changing the dynamics of the conflict. She bridges both worlds, the scientific precision her father values and the deeper understanding you represent. Her testimony could affect how this new approach to territorial control is viewed by authorities. The evening brought more revelations as Elizabeth's investigation continued. The young scientist discovered that the land itself seemed to resist being reduced to pure mathematics and measurement. Natural phenomena that Mary's defenders used to advantage consistently defied the military's attempts at scientific prediction. "Look, how she's revising their calculations," Sarah reported, her observers noting Elizabeth's growing excitement. "She's not just finding errors, she's discovering patterns that suggest an entirely different way of understanding how the valley works." Through her network, Mary learned that Elizabeth's findings were causing concern among the foreign military observers. The young scientists' data suggested that their hopes for a purely technological system of territorial control might be fundamentally flawed. "She's proving what we've always known," Eleanor observed, watching Elizabeth document another inexplicable variation in the evening air currents. "The land can't be fully mastered through machines and measurements alone. It requires a deeper kind of understanding." The critical moment approached as Elizabeth prepared to present her conclusions to her father and the assembled military observers. Her careful documentation showed not just the limitations of their scientific approach, but the existence of natural patterns that required a different kind of knowledge to understand and use effectively. "This goes beyond just proving their measurements." "Wrong," Major Camden explained, studying Elizabeth's preparations. "She's demonstrating why some aspects of territorial control can't be achieved through technology alone, no matter how advanced." Mary Cooper watched her cousin's methodical work. With growing appreciation, Elizabeth Hawthorne represented something unexpected, a bridge between the scientific precision her father valued and the deeper understanding that the ghost of the plains had taught his daughter. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to reveal why this convergence of different ways of knowing mattered more than just winning a single conflict. The defense of Clearwater Valley had become a demonstration of why true mastery of territory required both kinds of understanding, the precision of science and the wisdom that could only come from deep connection with the land itself. More documents arriving from Washington, Rebecca Whitman reported, her network having intercepted crucial correspondence. Elizabeth's been investigating similar projects across the frontier. She's found patterns of failure, places where pure technology couldn't overcome traditional knowledge. Through her observation network, Mary learned that her cousin's research went deeper than just analyzing the current operation. Elizabeth had been tracking the results of other attempts to implement her father's scientific approach to territorial control. "Look at these case studies," Sarah Chen showed Mary, her contacts having secured copies of Elizabeth's research papers. Every time they tried to replace traditional skills with pure technology, something unexpected happened. The land itself seemed to resist being reduced to mere measurements. Major Camden studied the documents with growing interest. She's documented systematic failures in their approach, places where their perfect calculations couldn't account for local conditions, where traditional knowledge proved more reliable than advanced instruments. Howard Hawthorne watched his niece's methodical investigation with understanding. Elizabeth has her grandmother's gift, the ability to see beyond surface appearances. Margaret always said that true knowledge comes from both studying and feeling, from combining precision with intuition. The evening brought new developments as Elizabeth expanded her investigation. She began interviewing local settlers, showing particular interest in how traditional knowledge predicted and worked with natural phenomena that the military's instruments often missed completely. "She's not just gathering data," Thomas called, softly from his position, watching Elizabeth document another inexplicable variation in the valley's behavior. "She's learning to read the land's own stories, starting to understand why some knowledge can't be captured by instruments alone." Eleanor Blacksmith, observing Elizabeth's growing fascination with traditional methods, saw a deeper significance in the young scientist's journey. "She's discovering what my people have always known. The true understanding comes from listening to the land with both mind and heart." Through carefully placed sources, Mary learned that Elizabeth's investigation was revealing patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions in modern military thinking. The young scientist's data suggested that technological control of territory required more than just advanced equipment and precise calculations. "Watch how she tests her theories," Running Deer instructed his sons, noting Elizabeth's careful blend of scientific method and natural observation. "She uses instruments to measure, but she's learning to trust her senses too. This is how real knowledge grows." The Martinez family found their traditional gunsmithing knowledge suddenly valued in unexpected ways. Elizabeth spent hours with Miguel, documenting how generations of experience with local conditions produced results that modern ballistic science couldn't easily explain. "She understands that every bullet's flight tells two stories," Miguel explained to Mary, "one that can be measured with instruments, and another that can only be known through years of working with the land's natural patterns." Through her father's telescope, Mary watched as Elizabeth's discoveries began to affect the entire military operation. The young scientists' questions weren't just challenging their technical assumptions, they were revealing why some aspects of territorial control required a deeper kind of understanding. "Your cousin's forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth," Howard observed, watching the growing tension in the enemy camp. "That progress doesn't always mean replacing old knowledge with new technology. Sometimes it means learning to combine different ways of understanding." Major Camden, whose military experience helped him appreciate the broader implications, saw how Elizabeth's research could affect future approaches to territorial control. "She's not just documenting the limitations of pure technology. She's demonstrating why effective control requires both scientific precision and traditional wisdom." The night deepened, and Elizabeth's investigation continued to reveal new layers of complexity. Her careful documentation showed how the valley's natural patterns created effects that could be partially measured by instruments but fully understood only through experience and careful observation. "Look at these correlations," Sarah reported, her observers noting Elizabeth's growing excitement as she compiled her findings. "She's mapping relationships between measurable phenomena and traditional knowledge, showing how they support and validate each other." Through her network, Mary learned that Elizabeth's discoveries were causing significant concern among the foreign military observers. The young scientists' data suggested that their dreams of perfect technological control might be fundamentally flawed, requiring a more nuanced approach than they'd imagined. "She's proving something vital," Eleanor noted, watching Elizabeth work late into the night. "That true mastery of territory can't come from either science or tradition alone. It requires finding ways to bring different kinds of knowledge together." The critical moment approached as Elizabeth prepared her final report. Her research demonstrated not just the limitations of a purely technological approach, but the possibility of something more sophisticated, a way of understanding and controlling territory that combined the best of both old and new knowledge. This goes beyond just proving their current methods wrong, Major Camden explained, studying Elizabeth's conclusions. She's showing why future approaches to territorial control will need to respect and incorporate traditional wisdom, not try to replace it entirely. Mary Cooper watched her cousin's methodical work with growing appreciation. Elizabeth Hawthorne represented something unexpected and vital, proof that progress didn't have to mean abandoning old wisdom, that true advancement could come from learning to combine different ways of understanding the world. The quiet farmer's widow prepared to show why this convergence of knowledge mattered more than just resolving one conflict. The defense of Clearwater Valley had become a demonstration of why true mastery of territory required bringing together the best of both worlds, the precision of modern science and the deep wisdom that could only come from generations of careful observation and respect for the land's natural ways. As the day of Elizabeth's final presentation arrived, the tension was palpable. The gathering was to be a turning point, a moment of reckoning not only for the military operation, but for the future of territorial control itself. The room was filled with military officials, scientists and settlers, all eager to hear the conclusions Elizabeth had drawn from her extensive investigation. Her father, Philip Hawthorne, sat stiffly at the head of the table, the weight of his scientific convictions heavy on his shoulders. Howard stood off to the side, watching his niece, with a mixture of pride and concern. Mary, standing just behind Elizabeth, could sense the delicate balance her cousin was walking. Elizabeth wasn't just challenging the methods of her father's research, she was confronting the entire paradigm that had shaped the military's approach. With a quiet but confident air, Elizabeth stepped forward. She unfolded a series of meticulously drawn maps and data sheets detailing her findings. Her voice was calm but resolute as she explained the discrepancies she had observed between the military's scientific measurements and the natural phenomena that had consistently defied prediction. "Look here," Elizabeth pointed to a map of the valley. "This area, despite showing favorable conditions for the enemy's technological strategies, continually defies expectations. We're seeing air currents, soil fluctuations, even subtle shifts in wildlife behavior that no instrument can fully capture." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. "These aren't just anomalies. They are evidence of a system at work, one that we cannot fully control with technology alone." There was a murmur among the military officials, some skeptical, some intrigued. General Hawthorne's face remained impassive, though Mary could sense the conflict brewing inside him. For years, Philip had been steadfast in his belief that technology could master any challenge, that scientific precision was the key to everything. Yet his own daughter was now proving that there was something more at play, something intangible that couldn't be measured by his instruments. Elizabeth continued, her confidence growing. Traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, has its own kind of precision. It is grounded in the land, in the patterns that have been observed and felt, not just calculated. I've spoken with the settlers here, with the Martinez family, with those who've lived in this valley for decades. They've long understood things that our instruments fail to capture. She turned to face her father, her expression softening. "This isn't a dismissal of science. It's an addition to it, a recognition that there are aspects of nature that cannot be quantified but can be understood." Philip Hawthorne stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his face tight with restrained emotion. His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You're suggesting that we abandon precision? That we throw away the very tools that have allowed us to advance so far?" Elizabeth's eyes met his, unwavering. "No, Uncle. I'm saying we must expand our view. We must accept that some things cannot be controlled, but we can learn to work with them. The land is not just a resource to be mastered. It's a partner, one that can be understood in ways that go beyond mere measurements. Mary watched the exchange closely. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Elizabeth and her father, but for the future of Clearwater Valley. She knew that, whatever direction this conversation took, it would shape the course of their lives and the very methods they would use to defend their home. Major Camden, ever the pragmatist, spoke up. What you're proposing is a hybrid approach, combining the strengths of both scientific precision and traditional wisdom. It's bold and risky, but perhaps it's the only way forward. Eleanor Blacksmith, who had been watching silently, nodded in agreement. There is power in both worlds. One teaches us how to observe, the other teaches us how to listen. A silence fell over the room as the weight of their words hung in the air. General Hawthorne was still, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. I've spent my career believing that we could perfect this land through control. But perhaps, Elizabeth, you're right. Perhaps we need to listen more carefully, to understand not just the land's physical properties, but its rhythms, its heart. There was a pause as everyone in the room processed the shift in his tone. It was a rare moment of humility from a man who had built his career on the belief in the infallibility of science and technology. Mary felt a wave of pride for her cousin. Elizabeth had not only changed their understanding of the valley, but had perhaps begun to change the very course of military thinking itself. As the presentation concluded, there was a quiet but palpable sense that things had changed. The military leaders were no longer fixated on perfecting their technological strategies. They were beginning to recognize the importance of a more holistic approach. Elizabeth had brought something invaluable to the table, a way of blending the old and the new, the measured and the felt, in a way that no one had anticipated. The conversation turned to practical next steps, but Mary knew that the real work was just beginning. It would take time for the military to integrate traditional knowledge into their strategies, and even longer for Elizabeth's findings to take hold in Washington. But the seeds had been planted. The defense of Clearwater Valley had become a much larger experiment, one that sought to combine the wisdom of the land with the power of technology. And in this delicate balance, Mary saw a future where both science and tradition could coexist, each enhancing the other. As the meeting broke up, Elizabeth turned to Mary, her eyes alight with a quiet satisfaction. "It's just the beginning," she said softly, almost to herself. "We've opened a door. Now we need to walk through it." Mary nodded, understanding. Together they had sparked something much bigger than a single conflict. What they had started was the beginning of a new way of seeing, a new way of understanding, and a new way of living with the land. And for the first time in a long time, Mary felt a flicker of hope that their future, the future of Clearwater Valley, was not just in their hands, but in their hearts as well. The weeks that followed Elizabeth's presentation saw a quiet but significant transformation in Clearwater Valley. The military began to adopt some of the principles Elizabeth had proposed, though it was far from an easy or seamless process. The rigid structure of the operation had always prioritized technology, numbers, graphs, and cold data over intuition or experience. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that something had shifted in the way they approached the land. Elizabeth's research was met with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, but it was undeniable that her findings were beginning to change the way military leaders and settlers alike viewed the valley. The soldiers stationed in the area, who had once relied solely on their high-tech equipment to map air currents, soil conditions, and environmental changes, began to work alongside the local farmers and hunters. Together, they observed and catalogued phenomena that had once seemed irrelevant, but now held value in a way they hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Elizabeth was walking along the valley's edge with Howard, who had been quietly supportive of her work from the start. As they walked, the wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of freshly turned earth and distant wildflowers. Elizabeth had taken to this kind of observation, spending more time outdoors, feeling the subtle shifts in the environment and listening to the land. "There's something different in the air today," she said softly, glancing up at Howard. He smiled, a rare expression for the usually serious man. "You're learning to feel it, aren't you?" Elizabeth nodded. "It's not just about what we can measure, Uncle. It's about knowing the land, the way it speaks, in its own language." Howard was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Finally, he spoke. "You've done something I never could, Elizabeth. You've found the bridge between what can be measured and what can be felt." His voice was gruff, but there was pride in it, something he rarely allowed himself to express. "Maybe it's time we learned to listen as well as observe." As their conversation unfolded, Elizabeth began to notice the subtle changes in the military's approach to the valley's defense. Major Camden, who had always been a pragmatic leader, had started to incorporate traditional methods into his tactics. He consulted with local settlers and even invited experienced trackers and hunters to teach his soldiers how to read the land's signs, how to tell the difference between a freshly disturbed patch of earth and natural weathering. The military's once cold, calculating methods began to blend with the warmth of lived experience. Soldiers were no longer just calculating probabilities based on numbers. They were learning to read the land, to interpret the stories written in the trees, the soil and the wind. And through it all, Elizabeth's theories began to gain traction. The settlers, too, were finding new value in what the military's technology could offer. The Martinez family, who had been making ammunition by hand for generations, worked closely with the scientific teams, showing them how their custom rounds performed in ways the new ballistic calculations could never predict. Elizabeth spent hours with Miguel, asking questions and making notes, drawing connections between the practical knowledge of the settlers and the theoretical framework of her father's scientific equipment. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Elizabeth turned to Miguel with a thoughtful look. "It's not just the bullets themselves, is it?" she asked. "It's the knowledge that goes into making them. You've learned to feel the temperature of the forge, the way the metal responds to your hands. That's not something that can be measured in a lab." Miguel chuckled, a low, deep sound. "No, it's not. But what you're learning is that knowledge is not just in numbers, it's in experience. Every crack in the earth, every gust of wind, every change in the weather, that's information too. And we've been living with it, listening to it for generations." Elizabeth nodded, a deep sense of gratitude settling within her. She had always respected the Martinez family's skills, but now she saw them with new eyes. They were not just artisans. They were interpreters of a deeper, older knowledge that had been passed down through the generations. The realization that both science and tradition had their own vital roles to play in understanding the land began to spread. It wasn't just the military or the settlers. Other groups began to see the value of this combined approach. Even the foreign military observers, initially hesitant to embrace anything that wasn't strictly scientific, began to ask questions. They started seeking Elizabeth's input on how traditional knowledge could complement their technological methods. Through it all, Mary watched her cousin's quiet revolution unfold. Elizabeth's journey had never been about seeking glory or recognition. It had been about uncovering truths, about showing that the land, the valley, could never be fully understood by numbers alone. It required a more holistic approach, one that valued both the precision of science and the wisdom that could only come from a deep, lived connection with the earth. And yet, even as Elizabeth's work began to shift the military's approach to territorial control, she remained focused on the broader implications of her research. It wasn't just about Clearwater Valley. It was about the future. Her investigations had uncovered patterns of failure in other regions where technology has replaced traditional knowledge, and she was determined to find ways to combine both methods for the long-term benefit of the land and its people. In the quiet of the valley, under the vast sky that stretched endlessly above, Elizabeth sat by the fire, poring over her notes. Howard had gone to sleep, but Mary joined her cousin by the campfire, sitting silently for a moment. "I think you've done it," Mary said quietly, watching the flames dance in the cool night air. "You've changed everything." Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She gazed into the fire, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "I haven't changed anything yet, Mary, but I've started something. We've started something. The real change will come when everyone learns to see the land differently, not as something to control, but as something to understand, something to work with." Mary nodded, feeling the weight of her cousin's words settle in her chest. The future, she realized, wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about forging a new way forward, one that honored both the land and the people who lived on it. A future where science and tradition didn't just coexist, but thrived together. As the fire burned low and the stars began to shine above them, Mary knew that Elizabeth's journey had only just begun. But she also knew that the path ahead was a new one that would lead them all into a future where knowledge was not just measured by instruments, but felt through the heart of the land itself. The seasons began to change in Clearwater Valley, and with them, the evolving landscape of knowledge that Elizabeth had started to build. The valley, once a battleground of technology versus tradition, had become a place where the two forces had learned to work together. Slowly but surely, Elizabeth's research and insights were rippling out into the wider community, transforming not just the military's approach, but the very fabric of life in the valley. Elizabeth's daily routine had shifted. She was no longer simply reviewing data or conducting experiments in isolation. Her mornings were spent in the field, meeting with local farmers, trackers and hunters, observing the land's subtle changes. Her afternoons were spent at the military command center, where she worked alongside scientists, generals, and even foreign officers, guiding them through a new methodology that blended technology with the wisdom of the land. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was walking along the riverbank with running deer, she marveled at the difference in the way she approached. Her work now, she used to measure and calculate, driven by the pursuit of cold facts. Now she relied on a different kind of precision, one grounded in patience, observation, and respect for the rhythms of nature. "Your people, you've known this valley for generations," Elizabeth said, as they walked beside the flowing river. "You've watched how it moves with the seasons. You understand things that no machine could ever detect." Running Deer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We read the river's language, its currents, its moods. Some things cannot be measured, but they can be known." His eyes sparkled with quiet wisdom. "The land teaches, if you're willing to listen." Elizabeth paused, looking at the river, the sunlight glinting off its surface. "I've spent my whole life learning how to measure everything, but you're right, the land is a kind of teacher. I'm beginning to see that." He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "You are on the right path, Elizabeth. Keep listening, keep learning." As Elizabeth's understanding deepened, her conversations with the military leaders also evolved. Major Camden, who had once been skeptical of combining tradition with technology, now found himself seeking her guidance. His soldiers had begun to show promising results, using both modern tools and the skills they had learned from local settlers. Still, the old ways weren't always easy to integrate into the fast-paced demands of military strategy. One evening, as they sat around a campfire after a long day of tactical training, Major Camden turned to Elizabeth. We've made progress, but I still don't quite understand how to make the two systems work together seamlessly, he admitted. The science is clean, precise, but when we're out in the field, that's when things start to feel messy. Elizabeth chuckled softly. It's true. Nature doesn't follow clean lines, but that's where traditional knowledge shines. It's adaptable. It's not about having perfect answers. It's about making the best choice with the information at hand. Camden's brow furrowed as he thought it over. So, you're saying that science should guide us, but tradition can help us adjust when things go wrong? Exactly, Elizabeth said. Science gives us the foundation, but tradition, experience, teaches us how to bend with the wind. When the foundation cracks, it's not about control, it's about partnership. As the days turned to weeks, Elizabeth's insights began to reach deeper into the military. Some officers, like Major Camden, began to actively seek out local knowledge, consulting with the settlers and learning to read the land's subtleties in ways that felt both new and old. It was a delicate dance, but it was working. There were fewer miscalculations, fewer failed predictions. The soldiers were no longer seeing the land as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a complex system to be understood. At the same time, the settlers began to take a more active role in shaping the valley's future. The Martinez family, with their deep knowledge of ballistics and craftsmanship, began collaborating with the military's engineers to design ammunition that incorporated both cutting-edge technology and traditional techniques. The results were astounding. Handcrafted bullets that flew straighter, hit harder, and performed better than anything produced by the military's conventional methods. Miguel Martinez had been one of Elizabeth's staunchest allies from the beginning. One evening, as they stood outside his workshop, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You've brought something to the valley, Elizabeth," he said quietly. "You've shown us that our knowledge isn't just old-fashioned, it's essential. Without it, we would have never made it through the worst of the war." He paused, then added, "Maybe it's time for all of us to remember that we're not just fighting for a piece of land, but for a way of life. For a future where all kinds of knowledge are valued." Elizabeth nodded. She had heard these words before in different forms, but now they felt more meaningful. She had always known the value of tradition, but now she was seeing how it could work with the future, not against it. The path ahead was not about erasing the past. It was about honoring it, blending it with new knowledge, and creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.